Welcome everyone. Today we are going to take you deep inside the story of a man who didn't just build a bank, he built a system. A man whose name still lives in the world's most powerful financial institution, J.P. Morgan Chase. A man who once rescued the U.S. economy not with force, but with confidence and cash. He had no official title, no political position, yet he held more influence than many presidents. This is not a story of praise or hate. This is a story of truth, of legacy, of money, of control of one man, J.P. Morgan. This story will also help you improve your English listening practice because it is told in clear, simple English with emotion and power. Stay with us until the end, because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is the story of how the modern world was shaped by the decisions of one man. Let's begin with part 1, starting from the very beginning, when J.P. Morgan opened his eyes for the first time. Part 1, The Boy Who Hated Weakness. John Pierpont Morgan was born in Hartford, Connecticut, in the United States. He entered a world of privilege. His father was already an influential international banker. But the boy who would one day control America's money was not physically strong. From birth, he suffered from chronic illnesses. He experienced seizures. He had a skin disease that made his nose red and swollen. He couldn't run, couldn't play freely, and was often sick, frustrated, and isolated. His mother was loving but strict. His father had no patience for weakness. He believed that one must be disciplined or be forgotten. This belief was pushed onto the young Morgan from the start. While other children played sports, Morgan was reading financial records, learning currencies, and memorizing market information. At a young age, his father sent him to advanced schools, including one in Germany. He didn't just learn math, he learned global finance, foreign languages, and how money shapes nations. While other boys dreamed of adventure, Morgan dreamed of controlling systems. He once said, "I don't want a hobby. I want a kingdom." When he was still a young man, he began working in New York City at a banking firm that represented his father's company. From his very first day, he was surrounded by conversations involving enormous deals, international trade, risky investments, and powerful people. Morgan didn't simply listen, he studied everything. He learned how fear and confidence moved markets. He learned that numbers stay honest, but people do not. Most importantly, he discovered that in finance, real power does not come from having money, but from making others believe that you are the only one who can save them. His personality was cold, sharp, and calculated. Even at a young age, people said his presence was powerful. He had a commanding voice and intense eyes, and his appearance alone intimidated many. He walked into rooms as if he owned them. He hated weakness, indecision, and anything less than perfection. His clothes were flawless, his cigars imported, his watches precise, and his beliefs unshakable. During the American Civil War, Morgan fought his own battle, the battle of reputation. He made his first controversial move. He bought a large batch of rifles from the government at a low price and sold them back at a much higher price. Many saw this as greed and betrayal. Whether it was ethical or cruel, we will not judge here. But this deal gave Morgan his first true reputation. The man who knew how to make the system work for him. The rise of the empire, Drexel, Morgan and Company. After the war, Morgan partnered with Anthony Drexel of Philadelphia to form Drexel, Morgan and Company. This was more than a bank, it was a power base. It quickly became the most influential private banking house in America. Morgan invested in railroads, steel companies, electric companies, and telegraph firms. But he didn't simply invest, he took control. If a business was failing, he stepped in, fired weak managers, replaced leadership, and rebuilt the company in his own structure. This practice became known as Morganization. Fix it the Morgan way or let it die. And it worked. Morgan saved railroads, banks, and industries from collapse. But each rescue made him even more powerful. His philosophy was simple. Never invest in a business, invest in the person who runs it. And if that person is weak, replace them. He disliked competition, chaos, and instability. He believed in one strong leader at the top, himself. The man behind the power. Morgan married Amelia Sturgis, the love of his life. But only a short time after their marriage, she died of illness. Morgan was devastated and never emotionally recovered from this loss. He remarried later and had children, but the happiness he once hoped for never fully returned. He hid his pain behind money, business, and power. Meanwhile, his lifelong skin disease worsened, and he grew extremely self-conscious. He avoided photographs, which is why very few pictures exist of him smiling. The king of railroads. In the late 19th century, railroads were the lifeblood of America. They carried people, steel, coal, cotton, everything that powered the nation. But too many small railroad companies were fighting one another, losing money, and pushing the entire system toward collapse. Morgan stepped in. He didn't only lend money, he reorganized entire industries. He forced peace between competitors. He merged weak businesses, replaced corrupt executives, and imposed strong leadership. One of his most famous interventions took place during a meeting known as the Albany Meeting. Two railroad giants were about to destroy each other through price wars. Morgan invited both sides onto his luxurious yacht, locked the doors, and calmly told them, "You will either cooperate or you will both fail." Hours later, the conflict ended, peace was restored, and Morgan became the uncontested ruler of the American railroad system. By the end of this era, he controlled the majority of railway lines in the United States, meaning one man guided most of the country's transportation system. But Morgan wanted more. He expanded into electricity, telegraphy, steel, and banking. He helped finance Thomas Edison's electric company and later merged it into what became General Electric, one of the most influential corporations in the world. Morgan was no longer just a man. He had become a machine of capital. The panic and the call for a savior. Near the end of the century, America faced one of the worst financial crises in its history. The stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Citizens panicked. Even the U.S. government was running dangerously low on gold. The dollar, which depended on gold for its value, was losing public trust. If gold reserves fell any further, the currency would collapse, and with it, the nation. The president at the time had no solution, so he called one man, J.P. Morgan. On a cold February morning, Morgan walked into the White House not as a guest, not as a servant, but as a savior. He told President Cleveland, "I will give you the gold you need. In exchange, I want a private bond sale with interest." This was not charity. This was a deal. Morgan rescued the economy and earned a massive profit from doing it. Very soon, gold reserves were restored. The dollar regained its strength, panic faded, and one message echoed across the nation. When the government fails, J.P. Morgan will fix it. But he will never do it for free. Some newspapers were shocked. Some politicians were furious. How could one private man hold more power than the United States government? But others whispered, "Thank God Morgan exists." After that moment, J.P. Morgan's name turned into legend. But legends attract fear. People began to ask, is this man too powerful? Can he control our lives? Who voted for him? Can a private banker become more powerful than a president? Morgan didn't care. He never answered critics. He only focused on the next move. Behind all this power, Morgan lived like royalty. His art collection filled entire rooms. His home on Madison Avenue looked like a museum. He had private clubs, private trains, private yachts. He smoked cigar after cigar every day. He spoke only to people he considered important, and if anyone wasted his time, he simply stood up and left. He hated reporters. He hated cameras. He once threatened a journalist with his cane for taking a photo without permission. His rosacea worsened and he grew increasingly sensitive about his appearance. Morgan didn't want fame, he wanted order. He lived by a few unbreakable rules. A man I do not trust cannot receive money from me, no matter what he offers. He trusted people, not documents. I owe the public nothing. He cared nothing for public opinion. Credit is only a matter of confidence. He believed fear destroys economies and confidence builds them. To him, money was not arithmetic. It was power, respect, and control. By the end of the century, Morgan had done almost everything. Controlled railroads, rescued the government, brought order to electric companies, silenced critics. Part 2. the birth of U.S. Steel and the most powerful man in America. The turn of the century was the age of steel. Steel built skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, ships, weapons, and factories. Steel meant power. Steel meant progress. Steel meant the future. Whoever controlled steel controlled the backbone of America. And one man ruled steel, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who rose from poverty to become an industrial giant. Emotional, proud, full of energy, charismatic, beloved by workers, devoted to giving away his fortune. He wanted to be remembered as a good man. Morgan was his opposite. Cold, controlled, silent, uncomfortable with fame, devoted not to charity but to order, power, and stability. They were opposites in every way, and opposites rarely join forces. But history was about to bring them together. By this time, Morgan had reorganized railroads, electricity, banks, and countless industries. His influence had grown to a level no private citizen had ever reached. But one thing stood in his way: Carnegie Steel. Morgan knew he could never dominate American industry unless he dominated steel. Carnegie, however, feared nothing, not even Morgan. When reporters asked Carnegie if he would ever sell his company to J.P. Morgan, Carnegie laughed and said he would never hand his empire to someone else. The public loved it. Carnegie looked like the friendly giant. Morgan looked like the hidden power behind the curtain. But Morgan understood something deeper. Carnegie's empire was the final barrier preventing him from completing his vision. Morgan wanted to create something the world had never seen before. A corporation larger than any business in existence. A single steel empire uniting dozens of companies under one command. And to build it, he needed Carnegie Steel. Smaller steel firms came to Morgan for help. They needed protection. They wanted stability. They said, "Bring us together. Make us strong. But we cannot challenge Carnegie without you." Morgan knew his moment had come. He organized steel companies. He prepared financial plans. He studied every piece of Carnegie's empire. Then fate intervened. Carnegie took a long trip to his homeland. During that journey, he wrote a simple note with the price he would accept for his entire steel empire. A price so high no ordinary man would dare consider it. Carnegie handed the note to his business partner, Charles Schwab, and said, "If Morgan agrees, I will sell." It wasn't a negotiation, it was a declaration. Schwab traveled back to America and met Morgan in his private library. Morgan sat quietly as Schwab handed him the note. Morgan read it, looked up, and said only, "Tell Mr. Carnegie I accept." No argument, no discussion, just a quiet agreement between two of the most powerful men in American history. And with that, Carnegie became one of the richest men in the world. Morgan became something even greater, the master of America's steel backbone. Morgan merged Carnegie's empire with dozens of other steel firms and created a new giant, United States Steel Corporation, known as U.S. Steel. It became the first corporation of its kind. Larger, richer, and more powerful than many nations. U.S. Steel employed hundreds of thousands of workers, controlled a massive share of America's steel supply, and shaped the infrastructure of every major city. Bridges, ships, buildings, and railroads all carried Morgan's influence. And there he stood silent, calm, unseen by the crowds, yet ruling the largest financial empire the world had ever known. Newspapers wrote, "A new king rules America. Is Morgan more powerful than the government? No private man has ever controlled so much. This is the age of the Morgan Empire." Some said Morgan saved industries. Some said he was too powerful. Some said he was dangerous. Some said he was a genius. Morgan never cared. His mission remained the same: create order, build stability, eliminate chaos. U.S. Steel was proof he could do it. Morgan never visited the steel mills. He did not walk near furnaces or watch the sparks fly. His work was different. He controlled the managers, the boardrooms, the financial plans, the expansions, and the competition. He believed one truth: a leader should be above the noise, not inside it. He let experts run the factories. He ran the system. Morgan's personal world was complicated. His face was heavily disfigured by rosacea, which made him intensely private. He refused to be photographed unless absolutely necessary. He lived surrounded by art, books, and rare jewels. He bought medieval tapestries, paintings, and manuscripts. His home was filled with treasures like a European royal palace. He traveled across Europe collecting unique objects and surrounded himself with the world's best advisors. He spent hours each day reading letters, financial reports, and personal notes. In many ways he lived simply, but in others he lived grandly. He ate quickly, spoke in short sentences, hated crowds, hated noise, and loved silence and control. But more than anything, he loved order. His mind needed structure, his world needed discipline, and his companies needed organization. That was why so many businesses trusted him. As his industrial empire grew, especially as the steel industry became unstoppable, people grew uneasy. Reporters accused Morgan of controlling railroads, electricity, steel, banking, even the government itself. This fear gave rise to a new phrase, the money trust. Many believed he held too much influence. Politicians wondered, could one banker control the entire American economy? Was it safe? Should the government intervene? Was this still capitalism or something closer to monarchy? Morgan remained silent. He never answered critics, never gave interviews, never explained himself. He believed that a man who is right does not need to shout. But a political storm was forming, and soon he would face another crisis, one even greater than the financial panic of the previous decade. It would push him back to the center of American history. It would remind the country that when the economy collapses, someone must step forward. And to many, that someone was still J.P. Morgan. He was not a king, not a president, not elected by anyone. Yet people whispered that nothing happened in America unless Morgan allowed it. Whether true or not, that belief created power. But that power was about to be tested. On the surface, the early 20th century looked strong. Industries boomed, people poured money into stocks, banks issued loans freely, railroads expanded, and new millionaires appeared everywhere. But beneath the surface, chaos brewed. Small banks borrowed recklessly. Investors gambled on risky stocks. Fake companies appeared. People chased fast money instead of real value. Eventually, the bubble burst. The stock market crashed. Banks ran out of cash. People rushed to withdraw their savings. Businesses couldn't pay workers. Factories shut down. Fear spread like wildfire. A true panic gripped the country. And there was a problem. America had no central bank. There was no Federal Reserve. So the government looked around and realized the only person with enough power to save the nation was J.P. Morgan. He was elderly now, not young or healthy, but mentally sharper than ever. He was in his private library when the panic began. Bankers, industrialists, government officials, business leaders, they all came begging, "Mr. Morgan, the country needs you." Like a commander returning to the battlefield. Morgan stood up, shut his doors, canceled his meetings, lit a cigar and said, "Bring me the facts." He turned his library into a war room and gathered experts, accountants, lawyers, bankers, and CEOs. Chairs were arranged in circles, financial statements were spread across tables. For days without rest, he studied every detail. He identified which banks were weak, which companies were lying, which loans could still be recovered, and which men could be trusted. Once he understood the situation, he acted. One evening, he summoned all the top bankers in New York to his library. Looking around the room, he told them, "You caused this mess. Now you will help fix it." Some resisted. They didn't want to risk their own banks to save others. Morgan said nothing. Instead, he stood up, walked to the doors, and locked them. No one was leaving until an agreement was reached. Hours passed with arguing, shouting, pleading. Morgan remained silent, calmly reading a book. At midnight, he finally looked up and said, "Gentlemen, you have 10 minutes to sign." And under pressure, they signed. A massive rescue fund was created, enough to stabilize failing banks and restore confidence. The next morning, newspapers declared, "Morgan saves Wall Street." He had analyzed the entire banking system, coordinated top financiers, supplied emergency funds, and prevented an economic collapse, all without any political authority, military power, or speech-making. He acted because no one else could. But this time, the public's reaction was different. They were grateful but also frightened. Why should the fate of the entire nation depend on one man? What if he died? What if he refused next time? Was America truly a modern country if it relied on a private banker? These questions helped create a movement for a national central bank. That movement eventually produced the Federal Reserve, a permanent institution to manage the nation's money, interest rates, and financial stability. In a way, Morgan's power was so great that the government created an entirely new system to replace him. Now began a new chapter, the government versus J.P. Morgan. He had saved the country more than once and brought order to chaos. He had done what government itself could not do. He had become more than a man. He had become a system. But America was changing. Reformers were rising. Public opinion was shifting. And for the first time, the government began asking whether any individual should possess such influence. This chapter of his life was not about building, it was about defending. As he grew older and more worn down, he faced public scrutiny, political attacks, and a slow erosion of his empire. A new president, Theodore Roosevelt, arrived in Washington with energy and determination. He set out to fight corruption and break the trusts, massive corporate combinations that dominated American industry. And Morgan, once untouchable, was suddenly in the government's crosshairs. Like Morgan's vast steel empire and the dominance of Standard Oil, his railroad trusts had become symbols of overwhelming corporate power. The public increasingly believed that these enormous companies were too large, too influential, and unfair to ordinary people. At the very top of that list stood the name of J.P. Morgan. Not long after Morgan had rescued the nation during the Great Financial Panic, the same country turned around and said, "We want to break your empire." And the attack came swiftly. To understand what happened, we must go back slightly. Early in the century, Morgan had made another enormous move. He helped create a new railroad giant known as the Northern Securities Company. It combined several major rail lines across the northern regions of the United States, giving it dominance in that part of the country. The company was immense, and under the laws of that era, entirely legal. But President Theodore Roosevelt didn't care. To him, Northern Securities was a monopoly, a dangerous concentration of power. He sued Morgan's company under a new antitrust law, marking the first time the United States government had ever directly challenged a business titan of Morgan's stature. When Morgan heard about the lawsuit, he was stunned. He had always worked with government leaders. He had saved the economy. He believed Washington trusted him. In a private meeting with Roosevelt's representatives, he said something unforgettable. "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." He meant, business disputes should be handled privately, not publicly. Why, he wondered, was the government trying to humiliate him? But this time the government said, "No. This time it will be public." Morgan couldn't believe it. He had spent his life bringing order to the economy, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court. For months, lawyers argued whether Northern Securities was truly a monopoly, whether it restricted competition, and whether it harmed the public. The entire nation watched. Wall Street watched. And Morgan watched silently from the shadows. In the end, the court ruled against him. Northern Securities was dismantled. It was a stunning moment. The most powerful man in American business had been defeated, not by markets, not by rivals, but by the law. After that, newspapers changed their tune. They no longer called him a savior. Now they cast him as the shadowy figure behind the curtain, the invisible hand manipulating the country, the king of monopolies. Political cartoons depicted him as a giant octopus with tentacles wrapped around railroads, banks, steel, and even Congress. The same people who once said, "Thank God for J.P. Morgan," now said, "We must protect the country from him." Even after this loss, Morgan continued to expand. He reorganized his companies, invested in new industries, and pushed outward into Europe and Latin America. He helped finance enormous public works such as canals and global shipping networks. He still maintained powerful stakes in his great industrial and financial enterprises. Yet something inside him had begun to change. He was older, weary, and less interested in constant battles. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, and now he spent his time defending it. Eventually, Congress launched a sweeping investigation known as the Pujo Committee. Its goal was to uncover the so-called money trust, the idea that Morgan and a small circle of bankers secretly controlled the nation's economy. And for the first and only time in his life, J.P. Morgan was summoned to testify before Congress. He arrived as an aging man, slower, heavier, still imposing but clearly worn by time. In the crowded hearing room, surrounded by lawyers and reporters, Morgan answered questions calmly. At one point he was asked, "Is it not true that banks lend money based on property and assets?" Morgan replied, "No, sir. The first thing is character." Before anything else, he insisted, a banker must ask, "Is this man honest? Can he be trusted?" The room was stunned. Morgan wasn't speaking just about banking, he was describing his philosophy of life. But the public no longer cared. They wanted reform. They wanted power shifted away from Wall Street and back to the government. After months of investigation, the committee issued its findings. They declared that Morgan and a handful of bankers held direct influence over dozens of major corporations, representing a vast portion of the American economy. They called it dangerous, undemocratic, and an unacceptable concentration of power. Their recommendations led directly to sweeping reforms. A permanent central bank, stricter financial regulations, and increased government oversight. Morgan didn't fight these changes. He understood they represented a new era. The age of the lone financial emperor was ending. He had lived in a time when one man could shape a nation's economy, but now the public wanted institutions, not individuals. He withdrew into private life, spent more time abroad, and devoted his final days to reading, writing, and reflection. He was not bitter. He was simply finished. The final days of J.P. Morgan. As the end approached, Morgan, once the master of American finance, had become a quiet, aging figure, watching the world move beyond him. He had already built his empire and defended it. Now only contemplation remained. Deep down he knew, "I will die, but the structure I built will endure." He spent his final months in Europe, staying in Rome, Paris, London, and Monte Carlo. Not for luxury, but for peace. After decades of creating railroads, steel empires, banks, and rescue plans that shaped entire countries, he now wandered slowly through art galleries, cathedrals, and museums, absorbing history rather than shaping it. His health declined. His face was marked by rosacea, his eyesight weak, his energy low. Headaches, fatigue, labored breathing, a failing heart. But his mind remained sharp. In Rome, at a grand hotel overlooking ancient streets, he met with diplomats, bankers, and art dealers. But something was different this time. He was quieter, more reflective, almost as if he were saying goodbye without words. He spent long hours alone in his suite, writing letters or simply gazing out the window in silence. One morning, he passed away peacefully in his room. No struggle, no sound. Just the quiet ending of a life that had moved nations. News spread instantly across the world. Headlines declared the death of a giant, the passing of the master of Wall Street, the close of an era. In New York, the stock exchange shut down temporarily in his honor, an honor usually reserved for presidents. Crowds gathered outside the Morgan Library in Manhattan as the nation recognized the end of one of the most influential lives in its history. Silence. Not everyone admired him, but everyone respected him. His body was 41:13, brought back to America. A private funeral was held in New York. 41:18. No grand speeches, no golden tombs, no royal ceremonies, just a quiet farewell. 41:24. From family, close friends, and business leaders. People didn't cry loudly. They 41:31. Just watched in silence as the man who once controlled the world's money was 41:36. lowered into the ground. Many were curious how rich was J.P. Morgan when he, 41:42, died. He had helped create billion-dollar companies. He had controlled, 41:48, railroads, steel, electricity, finance. He had saved the U.S. economy twice. So, 41:56. People expected him to be the richest man in the world. But they were shocked. His personal, 42:03, fortune was around $80 million. That was a huge amount but much less than people. 42:09. Expected less than Rockefeller, less than Carnegie. Why? Because J.P. Morgan never chased. 42:17. Personal wealth. He chased power, order, and legacy. He once said, "Money is only 42:23. A tool. The goal is stability. The reward is trust." Before his death, J.P. 42:30. Morgan had created something more meaningful than any office, the Morgan Library. 42:36. It was not just a library. It was a temple of knowledge and culture. Inside, 42:42, were ancient manuscripts, first editions of the Bible, letters from kings. 42:49, queens and presidents, original works by Mozart, Beethoven, and Michelangelo. 42:55, paintings by Rembrandt, Botticelli, and Raphael, books no one else in the world had. And 43:02, he left it not for his family, but for the public. He opened the Morgan Library. 43:08, as a gift to America. He wanted people to think deeply, read widely, and see. 43:14, beauty. This was J.P. Morgan's way of saying, if you want to understand. 43:19, power, understand history. Today, the Morgan Library and Museum is 43:26, still open in New York, a place where anyone can walk in and touch the past. 43:32, after his death, his banking firm J.P. Morgan and Company continued growing. 43:38, it became one of the most respected institutions in the world. The bank that, 43:44, advised presidents, kings, and governments, a financial engine for World War I. 43:51, place where global finance was coordinated. And in the year 2000 it, 43:56, merged with Chase Manhattan to become J.P. Morgan Chase. 44:02, today, it is the largest bank in the United States with trillions of dollars in assets. The name J.P. Morgan is still 44:11 on buildings, stock tickers, news headlines every single day. He is gone. 44:16. But his signature still signs the economy. J.P. Morgan was not a hero. He, 44:22, was not a villain. He was a system in human form. From his life, the world. 44:27. Learned. 1. The power of trust. He never begged. He never shouted. His 44:34. Power came from confidence in himself and in others. Credit is the trust of 44:39. The people. Lose it and you lose everything. 2. The importance of character. Even 44:47. When he made billion-dollar decisions, he looked at one thing. Is this man? 44:52. Honest. That was his rule. Even more than profit. 44:58. 3. Silence is power. He never gave speeches. He never wanted fame. He, 45:05, worked quietly but his results shouted across the world. 4. Don't just make. 45:11. Money makes structure. Morgan didn't just invest. He rebuilt, reorganized. 45:17. Stabilized. He fixed broken systems. He created order in chaos. 5. Never. 45:25. Panic in a panic. During financial disasters, he remained calm while others, 45:30, screamed. And because of that calmness, the entire country followed him. J.P. 45:37. Morgan never wrote an autobiography. He never told the world what he felt inside. But those who knew him closely, 45:44, said he didn't love money. He loved systems. He didn't chase luxury. He, 45:51, chased order. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to build something that would last beyond him. And he did. 45:58. He built companies, laws, trust, ideas, and a financial network that still runs. 46:05. The world today. Now the journey is complete. From a sick boy in Connecticut. 46:11. To a global financial giant, from building railroads to saving the U.S. 46:16. Economy, from court battles to creating institutions still alive today. From a 46:23. Man feared by presidents to a name that stands for stability. 46:28. This was not a story of good or evil. It was a story of impact. And even now, 46:34. Over 100 years later, the world still runs on systems that J.P. Morgan built. 46:42. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, helped you learn English, 46:48, or made you think deeply, subscribe to our channel, share it with 46:54, someone who needs to hear it. And remember this, 46:59, you don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to be perfect to be. 47:05, remembered, you just need to build something. 47:10, that lasts.